I'm Ann Phibbs, Director of Education for the Office for Equity and Diversity. Welcome to Queer, Indigenous, and People of Color, Changing the Face and Focus of the LGBTQ Movement. Our second conversation in this, our fifth year of the Critical Conversations about Diversity and Justice series. The Critical Conversation series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries. The libraries have developed a list of further academic resources on each of our Critical Conversation topics, which you can link to on our Critical Conversation webpage. We continue to offer live streaming of our conversations so that you can watch via our website in real time or at a later date, since they will be archived on our Critical Conversations webpage. Today I had the opportunity to meet with some people, and there's a gentleman from a college in Texas, and he said, I love your Critical Conversations. I watch them all the time. That was really cool. So, hello, Texas, and everywhere else, right? We've also added an opportunity for you to provide feedback on this series. If you signed in, we will email a link to an online evaluation, or you can access that link also on our webpage. As with all of our conversations, we'll start with some discussion among our panelists and moderator, and then move out for Q&A in the audience. So I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Jason Jackson. Jason Jackson serves as the Assistant Director for the Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life here at the University of Minnesota, where his work centers on educational efforts for staff, faculty, and students, and outreach across the U of M. In 2015, Jason co-chaired with Sei Yang, down at the end of the table, the inaugural Queer, Indigenous, and People of Color Conference, which brought more than 250 students, staff, faculty, and community members from the upper Midwest region of the U.S. to the University of Minnesota. Jason received his undergraduate degree in Communication Studies and his Master's of Arts in Higher Education Administration from the U of M. While a student at the U of M, Jason served as an intern for GSC in the Gender and Sexuality Center and co-founded the student group Tongues Untied for LGBT people of color. Currently, Jason instructs a course on personal leadership here at the U of M, and over the past 6 years, he's been involved with Twin Cities Black Pride and the Twin Cities Ball Scene. We're very lucky to have him in this community and at the U of M. Please welcome Jason Jackson.
Hi. Thank you so much again. As Ann said, my name is Jason Jackson, and I use he and him pronouns. And I'm really super excited to be here and have this conversation. This conversation is titled Queer, Indigenous, and People of Color, Changing the Face and Focus of the LGBTQIA Movement. Also, I want to take a moment and really thank the Office for Equity and Diversity for putting this conversation, these conversations, plural, on. And a big shout out and a lot of love to Wendy, Claire for orchestrating these, and as always, Dr. Ann Phibbs. And I always have to say Ann Phibbs, like her full name, because every time I see Ann, I'm like, hi. So yes, so as moderator for today, I have a few questions for the panelists to kick off the conversation for the first hour, and then we will move to the last 30 minutes for Q&A for the audience. We are currently still waiting on one of our panelists to get here. They are parking their car, so they'll be just joining us in a second. Oh, also a couple of grounding assumptions, because I'm that kind of person who likes to try to set the stage for educational sharing. First and foremost, if you could potentially or possibly, I'm saying this as nice as I can, turn off your phones or put them on silent, if you could. Being here in these moments that we often don't get a chance to get, if you can be as present as possible to avoid distractions. If you need to step out of the room, take a call, do what you need to do, feel free to do so as well. Take care of yourselves as needed. Oftentimes in these conversations that are critical, we need time to process, take a moment, and step out if need be, do what you need to do. And I also grew up in the South, where I need to know that people in the room are listening and that are present with me. So if at any point our panelists are saying something that you're like vibing with and that you're loving, like a snap or a clap or like a yes or whatever it is, please do so, right? We need feedback, we need love. Being up here isn't always the easiest. So I'm gonna go ahead and get us started and talk a little bit about the conversation we are about to have. So in the wake of creating social change, social justice movements also experience change from within. Historically, in the United States, LGBTQIA, Indigenous and people of color activists, organizers, and change makers have been marginalized and often tokenized by white voices within the LGBTQIA community. As queer, Indigenous, and people of color, and many of our allies work to change that narrative, we see a shift towards building a more intersectional movement. For instance, in 2011, PFUN Foundation, known as the Philanthro Fund Foundation, hosted its Bold Gathering, which brought LGBTQIA people of color together to build political power and change the course of LGBTQIA movements. And that quote was from Ari Gutierrez, the co-founder of the LA-based Honor PAC, an organization that advocates for the political empowerment of queer Latinx communities and Latinx Equality Alliance. Black Lives Matter, a movement that is critical and is a call to action and a response to the virulent anti-Black racism that permeates our society. On their website, they state, Black Lives Matter affirms the lives of Black queer and trans folks, disabled folks, Black undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and Black folks and Black lives along the gender spectrum. In Minnesota, the organization, the Minnesota Two-Spirit Society, an organization that promotes cultural awareness of Two-Spirit people in Minnesota and surrounding communities, is based on a foundation of intertribal traditions and values. Based in St. Paul, Shades of Yellow, also known as SOY, is the first and only Hmong lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer nonprofit organization in the world that works to provide support, education, advocacy, and leadership development to Hmong, Asian Pacific Islanders who are LGBTQIA. More locally, here at the University of Minnesota, just over 6 years ago, around 6 years ago, the discussion group Tongues Untied, a space for queer LGBT folks of color housed in the Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life, took shape as a discussion group for community members on and off campus, and I'm proud to say that group is still going strong to this day. Also here on campus, as Ann Phibbs mentioned, the inaugural Queer, Indigenous, and People of Color conference that took place on our campus, in our space, and again, almost 3 years later, it's still going strong, and they'll be having their third annual Queer, Indigenous, People of Color conference in Washington, University of Missouri, right? I'm looking at all the emails we get. I'm trying to remember where things. So that's still happening. And just this semester, I have to name this, just this semester, the long-running student organization, the Queer Student Cultural Center, launched Roots, a group for queer students of color, where meetings vary from talking about current events, common grievances, activism, and just hanging out, right? So I want to kind of take a moment just to place that out there, to really name the amount of organizing, the amount of intersectionality that is happening even in our own communities, and how important it is just to name and note that. Now we are here, launching this conversation which brings together an exceptional group of queer, Indigenous, and people of color voices representing the strength of activism, the intelligence of social commentary, and strategic elements of fundraising, policy, and organizing. These leaders on this panel are challenging LGBTQIA movements to replace what has been historically been and seen as the just us, very white agenda, with a new framing and a new agenda. I had to take a moment. That was a lot, and it was really important. And to sit with that. I kind of got emotional for a second, because when I moved here 8 years ago, these spaces, these opportunities, these very specific opportunities around intersectionality were very, very few and far in between. And now I'm in this space with my community, and it feels so good. Okay. Moving on, Jason Jackson. I want to introduce our panelists. Hi. Our panelists, I'm going to start from my side and on. I'm going to start off with Aja Gildersleeve. They use they, them, and their pronouns. They are a Black queer agitator based in Minneapolis. They received their BA in political science and currently work in digital media. and is a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Minneapolis. They have several years of experience working in various communities in the field of media, education, and local government. Aja is a ride or die when it comes to solidarity, intersectionality, and empowering youth and adults to access tools to build and maintain agency and power. I want to hear some love. Next up, we have Lupe Castillo. She, her, and hers pronouns, is a fiercely committed, community-driven development, culturally reclamation, Indigenous, let me back up. They are fiercely committed to cultural reclamation, Indigenous sovereignty, and strengthening the culture of wellness. Lupe believes that by creating a world that we want to leave our future generations will ensure the well-being of all. Unraveling the racist systems that silence underrepresented communities must be addressed. Lupe's responsibilities have included board president, undoing racism as a facilitator, community building, artist, activator, new initiatives consultant, and Indigenous rights. She remains vigilant in the quest for community wellness. Give it up for Lupe, y'all. Next up, we have the one and only Alfred Walking Bull, who uses he and him and his pronouns. Si Chango Lakota. Alfred is enrolled citizen of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe in South Dakota. He is the communications manager for PFund Foundation, the regional LGBTQIA grassroots community foundation serving the upper Midwest states, such as Minnesota, Iowa, North and South Dakota, and Wisconsin. His experience is in journalism and communications, which brought him to Minneapolis, where he served as the managing editor for The Circle, the Native American community newspaper from South Dakota, where he served as communications specialist for his tribal government. Alfred's background also includes political organizing for elections, issues, and community. He identifies as a gay, queer, two-spirit, and a person of faith. His hobbies include reading, designing, and percolating the perfect cup of coffee. Yes! And last, and certainly not least, the person who I would maybe claim or call like the other half of my odd couple over there. Stay Yang, she, her, and hers. Stay identifies as a first-generation Hmong American and queer. She received her master's in social work at the University of Minnesota. Say is passionate about working in the LGBTQ community on racial justice as well as on domestic violence prevention. She is the co-founder of the Upper Midwest Indigenous and People of Color Conference and serves on the leadership team of Shades of Yellow, which is one of the only LGBT organizations that serves the Hmong community. Say is excited to share with us that she will be attending the first Global Hmong LGBTQ convening in Thailand in December. Give it up for Say Yang. Wow, all right, so I'm gonna go ahead and just jump right into our panelists and give them an opportunity to answer the questions. I just wanna also note that the questions I ask, you don't have to answer all of them if you don't like. But this first one, I definitely would like to get us started, to get a chance to know who we all are on this panel. So, you all are a few of the movement leaders for creating social change in our local and national community. Tell us about what brings you to this work and what are some of the challenges and rewards that come with it. We can popcorn it, do whatever you like.
Well, hello. Thank you, Jason. So, again, my name is Alfred Walking Bull. I'm the communications manager for PFund Foundation. And I am not from Minnesota, so I don't do the Minnesota nice thing where we all wait and we wait for other people. I'm from South Dakota. We believe in being forthright and, speaking when we need to speak. But one of the things that, as a Asichanko Lakota is that like we ask our permission from our elders in the room before we speak, and so I just want to ask forgiveness from my elders for making the presumption that I have more knowledge to share than they do. And so one of the things that brings me to the work that I do is the background that I grew up in South Dakota. I grew up on the Rosebud Indian Reservation, and there weren't a lot of examples of what it means to be Two-Spirit, what it means to be Winkte, what it means to be LGBTQ. And so when I came into my own, I realized that there was, of course, but it's that situation where everybody knew before I came out at the turn of the century. That's the one thing I love about being a non-millennial is that I get to use terms like that. So when I went to college, that was one of the first things that I was able to figure out about myself because I didn't have good examples. I had one cousin, and the talk in the family, and this was from people who traditionally had a role for LGBTQ people, who traditionally had a role. But one of the impacts of colonialism, racism, and white supremacy is that they adopt very Christian overtones to what it means to be LGBTQ. So I had one cousin, and the one thing that my family always said is, don't be in the same room alone with this cousin. And that was the stigma that I grew up with. Well, that's what it means to be LGBTQ, is that you cannot be trusted. And so when I came out and I started doing activist work and advocacy work in 2006 in South Dakota, we fought the marriage ban campaign in 2006. It was a very interesting time to be LGBTQ in a rural area where you really basically have to justify your existence, not just as a person of color, but as an LGBTQ person. And so it's been very interesting for me to see the community go from that to where we are now, where we're having space to talk about what it means to be an LGBTQ person of color, what that means for our assets, what it means to be an asset for our community. And so growing up with that, and coming here has been just so encouraging. And doing the work that we do at PFund Foundation. PFund Foundation is the community foundation that awards leadership awards across the 5-state region. And as the communications manager, I get to hear a lot from people in South Dakota, in North Dakota, in Wisconsin, and Iowa, in these rural areas, from people of color who, like me, didn't have a lot of agency and a lot of space to really talk about their needs and what they have to offer in the community. And I think one of the biggest things that brings me to the work that I do is the friends that I have in my life, that I've made throughout my life. So when I was in South Dakota, one of the best friends that I had was really helping me out through a hard time, and literally was just like, okay, well, you don't seem to be eating because you're poor, so we will take you and I will feed you and all this sort of stuff. And she was a very strong a woman of great faith, and her experience was trans, and that was the last thing that I had ever experienced as part of her experience. And so that really set the tone for how really approaching trans issues, the trans community, and gender nonconforming people, was that like you see their humanity first above all else. And so yeah, I think that's the next thing. I'm gonna punt off to whoever wants to take it.
I will save you. I will save you. And since the mic is already going, again, my name is Say. And of course, I got to put in the disclaimer, whatever I say does not represent my place of employment. So for me, I guess we could start about, I don't know, where I came from, how I grew up, because I didn't always have the LGBT analysis. So my parents are immigrants. They survived, or they flee genocide and in the Vietnam War, and all this stuff. If you know anything about Hmong people, you probably heard that a million times. But what comes with it is some PTSD, some mental health, right? And I think that really trickled down to me and my siblings. And of course, as refugees, when you come here, they kind of put you in poor neighborhoods. And so my parents, we all lived in public housing. They stuffed like all 8 of us into a 3-bedroom. And so I say this because I really had the class analysis first before anything else, because I was in public housing. And a lot of my friends, their parents owned the house, and so I would never want to invite them to my house because, there was just that class analysis. And then, growing up, my sister, there's only 2 girls, me and my sister, and she was actually in out-of-home placement for the majority of our childhood. And so I felt like, just being the only daughter, a lot of stuff fell on me, as the female in the family. And so that's kind of where I really got my gender analysis. And then my dad's, as some of you know, my dad's polygamous. And so, just seeing that relationship dynamic between my dad and my mom and my stepmom, and just, that really affected the way I see gender. And then, I came out, went to college, and I went on this, I came out, I went to college, and then I met this mentor, and she knows who she is, she's in the room. And she really introduced me to the LGBTQ movement, really looked out for me. We ended up going on this leadership trip together, and then I really learned, oh my gosh, this is like what it means, for me to be queer, and all this work that we have to do. And we got practice. We, went out with the Anti-Violence Project, went out and passed out some condoms, and we, went to shelter, did some work, met really cool leaders. And that really sparked it for me. And I think it was that trip that I just called my boss. I was going to work at the camp as an art director. Just called my boss, a couple of days before I was supposed to start, and just really told her, hey, this is what I'm going through. Like, I don't think my heart's going to be with you all at camp. I really want to do this LGBTQ work. And so that really, I think, launched it for me. And I felt like now going back, it has always been there for me, like, I probably always knew I was gay, and just, now I'm picking up all these things from my childhood, like, oh my God, that moment, I totally was gay, just thinking about, some of the things that I was doing, So, yeah, so that for me really launched it, and I think in that moment, it was getting the language, and being able to name it, because I felt like the experience was, I was there, I just didn't know how to put into words. And obviously English is my second language. So then that took a little bit to be like, okay, this is what I'm experiencing. This is how I name it. Yeah, and then she connected me to Soy. And so that was a really good experience. When I was out, I felt like I wasn't really connected to my community. And so just after that, I felt like things fell into place. I met really cool people. I learned how to organize. I'm still really involved in it. It's really close to my heart. And the question, you ask about some challenges and some rewards. I think, the whole intersectionality work, and in Minnesota, there's so many Hmong people, and that's great, but also so many Hmong people that know your parents and, know you and criticize you. And, that's a challenge because people aren't just ever like, oh, that's the gay person that does all this work, or the person that tries to convert our kids, It's so-and-so's daughter of the whatever clan, and it's like the whole, the whole 9 yard is like, connected to my work. And so, that's a challenge for sure. Even when we organized the conference, there's always people that, aren't going to be happy with the way we did it. And I think it hurts more when it comes from your own community criticizing the work you're doing. When you see the work as trying to move us along, to be better, to heal ourselves, to get our own skills, to move, to do our own stuff, to take care of ourselves. And so I felt like that was some of the challenges. Sometimes in this work, I think just doing the intersectionality piece, some people don't really see it, like if you, as a queer person of color, if you start doing maybe classwork, then they're kind of like, I don't get it, it's not related, because they're stuck on the LGBT piece only, right? And I felt like that's also a challenge, because you're always going back and helping people understand how this relates with you, but you're also trying to move the movement along. I feel like that's a really big challenge. and reward. I mean, just be able to be there. I think it's pretty amazing. Or even like building the groundwork for other people coming up. I felt like that's a reward.
Powerful. Thank you for inviting us to just one of the many critical conversations. I'm thankful for all of you that have wanted to share this space with us, and also just thinking about those that are not with us. So if you just think of someone, silently just say their name, bring them into the room with us. I think as we gather in these spaces, it's an honor, but also hugely, hugely can be traumatic to have these conversations. There's many stories that we will never hear. We are just some of the individuals that do work. We are just some of the individuals that are seen for our work. There is so much amazing work in community. I think we would all agree that maybe goes unnoticed, but still makes a huge impact. I think one of the ways in which what brings me here is I have a passion for equitable access. I have a passion and a commitment to have individuals and families do well. I am hugely committed to, if you have a society that states, I'm not saying that we do, but that states we are all equal, and that states we are all to be valued, then we need to hold our processes accountable to that belief, to that voicing of that story. So I grew up, something you mentioned about the analysis, say, I grew up very aware of my Chicana India identity. That was one of my first lessons in the differences of perception and language. Chicana in the Mexican Indian community can be seen and has been seen to be very derogative. It equates your own personal commitment to identifying with your indigenous rights, but also to your responsibilities, not only within your own life, to have agency of your own life, but to have a responsibility to heal and help and nurture your community. So our beliefs are that we, need to take care of ourselves, absolutely, and not in an arrogant, narcissistic sort of way, but to take care of ourselves in a way that's healthy and being well, so then we can take care of our families. Therefore, we can take care of our communities. And when we do that, we're able to intersect with other nations, whether they be Asian Pacific Islander, whether they be indigenous from the northern lands. My people come from the southern lands, whether they be from African heritage. That's where that intersectionality work really makes an impact into all of our lives. I was a mom with 4 kids, believing that I wanted to go to college, had to release the systems and people that did not support that. So I came up to the University of Minnesota because I felt if I'm going to work my butt off, it might as well be at the University of Minnesota. And I came across the path of some amazing mujeres, some amazing Mexican American women leaders at the University of Minnesota. They assisted me in getting registered for classes. I found an apartment and found a job all within 3 months once that decision was made. We are fierce. When we decide something, everyone better watch out. So that also goes within our organizing and our commitment to each other and our commitment to you. So as a student, I knew the angst, I knew the shame, but I also knew the pride of being a person of color within a dominant white supremacist society. I never had the language. When it was in this institution that I learned the politics of race, the politics of class, and the politics of gender. It was in these systems that my skills were put to task. I needed my children to do well in school, I needed to do well in school, and I needed to access resources. Right away, joining forces with the Student Parent Center to say we need to organize to have these resources accessible to new students that are parents, like I was. So those lessons were early on. The mentors that I met at the University of Minnesota, and you will hear her name over and over and over. She was a brilliant example of owning space at the university, and at times when it was not supported. My professors were amazingly fierce without apology. Eden, Rusty, just to name just a few. There was Lisa, who also did intersectionality work. They understood me. They could get me. They could hear the challenges that I had at times of learning this language, but being so committed to not only understanding it, but to embody it in a way that I could then talk and share with other individuals that have the similar struggles. We just have different names. We just have different pasts. We just have different journeys. But it's about social justice. It's about equity. It's about access to health care. It's about access to education. And some of those challenges are still present today that we work with. Indigenous rights and sovereignty. How do we access our sovereign right to do well by our families and our communities? The rewards, of course, are getting to know some of you, having you in my life, having the work continue even though we step away. We do our work, but to be able to come back together. For me, some of the rewards has been having individuals at my kitchen table. I don't organize with anyone that I cannot share a meal with. That's basic and fundamental for me. I think the organizing challenge at times is that we're overspent. We're overutilized. We're over-requested. We're over-tasked. We're over-critiqued. So we need these spaces that are safe and that are nurturing. We need to be able to share with each other, I don't know that I can do this anymore. And someone else can say, oh yeah, you can, and yeah, you will. So.
All right. Yeah, I'm Aja, as Jason. That was a good introduction. Thank you. And I don't know, this might be really creepy, but is your name Luke? Hey, what's up? I grew up with Luke in the same town. We're in the same music scene. But I kept looking at you really creepily because I was trying to figure out who is this person that I probably knew like 10 or 12 years ago. But yeah, so it's just really good to hear affirming things that were said that resonated deeply with me on the panel already. To hear similar experiences. I grew up mostly in a white town in Rochester. And I think when I hear y'all talk about language and gaining access to the language to name what was happening, that was an important part of what brings me to this work, is being aware that it wasn't me, like growing up as a dark-skinned, like genderqueer, queer person in a mostly heteronormative, like white supremacist town or city was hard because I'm over here thinking I'm the one that's crazy for feeling some type of way, right? We get gaslighted a lot in these progressive faced environments where it's like we're not racist because we don't say the N-word, or we're not homophobic because we don't say the F-word, and all of these things. Like, we are well-intentioned, white, cis, heteronormative people that like are not being oppressive because we have this image of progression. And so as a person, for me, growing up in that, I felt gaslighted constantly. And that's a lot of trauma. And I'm still dealing with healing with that type of trauma, on top of historical racial trauma, and trying to do the work. And so when I really got radicalized and when I really started realizing that this wasn't me, that there is a larger system of oppression, that was when I was in college. And I went to a conference, and like I resonate with you, Zay, when you're saying like you went to a leadership trip with someone. Like, I had a person, Mr. Hines, who was the diversity and inclusion director at Winona State, and what he did was he took, I was a part of the LGBT student group, which is another thing that is a challenge for me because I had to choose an identity to focus on. So when I was growing up in Rochester, I wasn't really out as a queer person, but I was focusing on my blackness. And everything, it was like, it just feels like things were compartmentalized because I didn't hear a lot about intersectionality. Like, I was growing up black, and like, that was what I was focusing on when I was growing up. And then I came out when I was going to college, like in high school when I was going to college. And then I'm like, oh, I want to focus on like my queerness and really put a lot of energy into my queerness. And it was hard for me to be a part of the BSU, like the Black Student Organization, because I was feeling like I had went to a couple meetings, and maybe this was just coming from me, but I felt like I couldn't be my whole self in that space. And because I feel like white supremacy also has to do with that, because in those black spaces, there are a lot of respectability politics and a lot of trying to assimilate to whiteness. And so it was hard for me to be black and queer in a lot of spaces, and I'd be in the queer space for the LGBT full spectrum group, and I'd be the only black person or person of color in that group. Like, and I'd have to compartmentalize and just focus on my queerness and talk about my queerness in that group. And so in college, we had all these marginalized groups. We had the like the API group, the Asian student group. We had a Muslim group on campus. We had the Black Student Union. We had the queer groups, and we were all dealing with oppression on campus in some sort of way, in a lot of different ways. And we weren't really working with each other. We weren't really like seeing each other as like we should be together. It's more like a lot of competition for resources. And what Mr. Hines did was he took a bunch of us from all these student groups on a trip to St. Cloud for the Power and Diversity Conference. And I went there my junior year with a group as a representative from the LGBT club, with members from the BSU club, members from the API club, members from all these different clubs on campus, multicultural clubs on campus. We went on a trip together, and we learned a lot. Like, I remember crying so much at that conference. Like, everybody was crying at that conference because it was like, whoa, like, so affirming. And then also, like, we got all this language. Like, we knew all this stuff, but we were just getting all this language affirmed. And we were also, then when we got back, we did a debrief with Mr. Hines and a reflection, and he was like, okay, y'all need to work you need to work together, right? Like, you all want, we didn't have a multicultural center on campus. And so then we led a campaign called No Space, where we were fighting for a cultural center for marginalized groups to be able to have a space where they could be safe and where they can organize and where they could have a space that was there for them on campus, because everywhere we were experiencing violence. And that was being erased because our university was trying to say we have diversity, like we have black people on our posters and queer, like they're like, you're represented at the university, there's diversity, but that's why I had an issue with the word diversity, because with diversity you can still have oppression, right? Just because you have people that look differently doesn't mean those people have power or have agency. And so that's what Mr. Hines taught us, and all the groups ended up working together, and that was my first occupation. We occupied the middle of campus, built a cardboard box, and we stayed out there for a week. and occupied in the middle of campus, going around, like letting people know what we're doing, canvassing, staying in that space and not moving in that space. That was my first occupation. And as y'all know, we have a lot of occupations in Minnesota, and I was thinking back like, whoa, I've done this before. I've been doing this, right? And that's where I really got radicalized, and I'm just now reflecting on it and realizing that I have to do this. What brings me to this work is my consciousness. I cannot, like now that I have all this language and know exactly what's happening to me, I'm not being gaslighted as much because I can see it for what it is, but I still have to carry the burden of that every day, and that's weighing on mental health, that's weighing on everything that has to do with my existence. And so I think that's, just living with that consciousness alone, like I think about James Baldwin a lot, to be conscious is to constantly be in a state of rage. And that resonates with me so much because that's what I feel. Like I cannot just sit here and not act when I know that this is happening to me and my community and I know what's really going on. So I think one of the rewards to doing this work is I get to be affirmed by so many people, and now we're in a movement. And I'm being affirmed by this movement and people are recognizing me. I'm seeing Black Lives Matter signs everywhere more. I'm seeing more talk about this. We couldn't even talk about race when I first moved here and I was working for the city. And we were supposed to be doing equity work, but we didn't name white supremacy. We didn't name racism that was direct racism that was happening, coded language that was happening. We weren't naming any of those things. We were like, let's talk about healthcare. Let's talk about access to this. Let's talk about how we have all these nonprofits that are doing the work and we're the top for funding for nonprofits. But nobody wanted to talk about how we are the most despaired when it comes to people of color, indigenous people, even queer, marginalized people between white folks. Nobody wanted to talk that. We are have one of the largest disparities in the entire country. They want to talk about how we're progressive. And so that's what we had been struggling with. But one of the most of the rewards that I'm facing now is no, these are coming to light. People are knowing, youth, I work with youth are knowing the truth. Youth are starting to get all this access to information, all this language at a young age, and I see their power. And so that's a reward for me to be able to work with youth and see that youth are rising and in their consciousness and in their knowledge. And the biggest challenge is, like I said, is mental health. Trying to find self-care, because even when I'm not on the front lines doing the work and organizing and agitating, I still have to sit with this consciousness. I still have to go on Facebook and see that another person was killed. I still have to see all the stuff that's happening. If somebody's not getting killed, somebody's in Edina getting dragged in by plainclothes officer because they were walking around a sidewalk construction in the middle of the street and they were Black. Or, indigenous people, trans people dying every day, trans women, Black women. All of this, you see, it's happening. It's happening constantly, every minute. It's happening every second that is going by right now. And I have to sit with that, and that weighs on your mental health. And I've lost at least 3 people in this movement to suicide within the last year. And so just trying to focus on what does healing actually look like for us? What does self-care actually look like for us? Because even if we're not doing the work, we're still hurting. So, yeah. Sorry, that was a lot.
No,
I might say some triggering things, I understand, take care of yourself, and
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm trying to take care of me over here because my wheels are really turning from a lot of what's just been said. If it's okay with the panelists, I'm going to go off cue a little bit. Okay, good. Okay. Because there's so many things, and I want to just start by saying, too, that because one of the questions, and I know that you addressed this, Aja, what are the impacts of white supremacy to the work that queer, indigenous, and people of color are doing? And I want to put out there that when we say the word white supremacy, I know oftentimes the first thing that comes to our minds are, the white triangular hats, right? And we see white supremacy as everyday occurrences, even in 2016, without the hats, without the robes. We see them when we see things scrawled in phrases such as build the wall as white supremacy. We see them in our media oftentimes. So just make sure I put that out there. White supremacy is very well and alive. in the worlds that we live in. But I want to go back to the piece and kind of talk about the struggle and like the mental health, particularly as some of the most marginalized people in the world that, in the U.S. society anyway. And I've been, somebody posed this question to me, and I want to put this out there. It was another queer person of color asked me, Jason, what does it look like for you as a black, gay, feminine man, right, working at the university? What is it like for you to not struggle? What does it look like for you to not struggle, right? And by struggle, I mean having to think about my black communities, my queer communities, my trans black communities, right? How I move my body, where I put my body, where I put my life. And when the question was posed to me, I had a hard time answering that question, so that may be a hard one too, but I wanted to put that out there. Again, this question of what does it look like for queer, indigenous folks of color to not be constantly in survival mode and or to struggle?
And you're right, it's a very difficult question because as Aja and Alfred and Say have all mentioned, the challenges are constant. We are barraged constantly by efforts that are institutionalized racist mechanisms. That's always going to be present until we are able to make a deep impact. Doing well has many different lenses. It has many different ways that it looks like being well, healthy, happy, and that changes sometimes on the daily. Being well within our own beings is only one aspect because we are constantly thinking about the well-being for our families. We are constantly thinking about the well-being of our communities. To have healthy work environments and healthy systems that we work in, we haven't really seen a whole lot of that. What Spirit Day was yesterday, anti-bullying, no bullying. How many times have we witnessed and been subjected to mean girl bullying in boardrooms, in work environments, in organizing? Has anyone experienced that besides me? I don't know. How many of you have ever experienced that with your colleagues? Raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. When somebody does not support your mission of equitable access to resources, maybe it's a discussion on looking at funding for POC community, people of color communities and indigenous communities. And they're like, no, we'll make it a general fund. Don't worry about it. You're like, no. When working with PFund, we had the first in the United States at that time, Communities of Color Endowment. That was a grassroots effort to make a deep systemic impact on philanthropic giving here in Minnesota and within the 5-state region. It was not easy. It was hard to change the paradigm of having that be looked on as also being socially just in the way that we thought about funding opportunities. That helped create the new leadership cohorts. That helped create new avenues of conversations that made everyone look at racism and philanthropic giving across the nation. That was a deep impacted change brought about grassroots efforts of community organizers and philanthropic hearts and donors. So when we talk about well-being and what does that look like, I can name it, I can dream it. Does that mean that it happens every day? Not at all. If I'm being honest and real, Not at all. Because sometimes we step away for our own health. Sometimes we step away for our own fiscal management. Sometimes we step away to take care of our alien parents who are great-grandparents to some. It doesn't mean that challenge, that angst, that sadness still doesn't exist. So.
Well, from my experience, more concretely, the thing that stood out was what Lupe said was to be able to share a meal. This is what it means to be doing well. It means to be able to laugh, to celebrate, particularly in Indigenous communities. Native people are some of the funniest people you will ever meet. Despite all of the media portrayals, we're usually in headdresses and looking stoic out onto the prairie. That's what we do in our spare time. See, exactly, this is what we enjoy. We enjoy creating spaces where we can laugh, where we can be whole people, where we can forget about all of the trauma and all of the anger and all of the rage that exists outside. The thing that I enjoy about working for PFund Foundation is that when we have a new cohort of individual leaders, we support them through the Leadership Award Celebration. We started it this year, and it was a space that we gathered everyone together, not just to be celebrated, but at the very beginning, inviting them in the morning to go through a planning session, a dreaming session, a visioning session, a design thinking session. They picked a particular challenge, and this one was public accommodation, and they designed what they thought was going to be the best solution to public accommodation for genderqueer, gender non-conforming, and trans folks. And it was being able to see them in that space. And I'm only in my 30s, and it's amazing to me to be able to see younger people come together and to be visionary and to laugh and to enjoy a meal and to have that space to be able to uphold them and uplift them in a place where they can have that freedom, where they can have that moment where they are a whole human being. They don't have to be sectional. They don't have to cut themselves up. They don't have to hide themselves. They can bring everything to the table. And so I think the work that we do at PFund Foundation, like Lupe was saying, that we changed our focus. And it's really, I really enjoy the fact that we're having this discussion, because for a long time our organization was known for throwing parties and fundraising and having galas and all of this. There's nothing wrong with that. There's wonderful creative energy and joy that comes in being in community, but it was also that there wasn't a major directional shift. There wasn't a conscious effort in how we awarded our grants. And so 2 years ago, as a result of the bold gatherings, PFund Foundation started its elevated priorities, which were trans and gender nonconforming communities, which were LGBTQ people of color, and LGBTQ North Dakotans and South Dakotans, people in rural areas. And it was because we were able to create those spaces, however temporary they were, however ephemeral they were, where people could come together, where they could be visionary, where they could be their whole selves. And so I think that having tastes of those, the goal is always, every generation forward, is to create a space and an attitude where that's normal. Mm-hmm. You can be a whole person. Our work right now, in this particular moment, is not there yet. We have to be the ones that are creating those spaces for future generations where it is going to be okay. We are going to be uplifting them. We're going to be encouraging them. And so that's, and like I said, it's important to have a good sense of humor about what we do, because, it's my coworker, my colleague back there, Tom, we were talking about this earlier. He was looking at the questions. He said, "You have answers for all of these." And I said, "It's just like any other day with me, isn't it?" That's what I do. I just come up with these ideas and we make things happen. And that's a shift that's happened in this community, where a person of color can have ideas, where I can be visionary, where we can all be visionary, and we can support work where that's okay, and where people can come together to laugh and enjoy and create and uplift one another.
I'm like, I don't want the mic. I don't have an answer. I really hear, what both of you say, and I really agree. I think it's making time to build people that really love you, people that really understand you, people that don't judge you, and for me, like, I'm a mental health practitioner, so you see things on media, and that's very different from when you are, using 8-9 hours to sit across somebody that's telling you something that is actually happening, and you do it every single day. I mean, that for me is like, wow, it's real, and it's happening. And then I see it on media, and it's like, how do I take care of myself? And it's exactly what you say, be around people that care about you, be around people that understand you, people who are, also going through the same struggle. And for me, I mean, I can't stop. I feel like when I stop planning, I stop organizing, when I stop at all, that's when I start thinking, okay, I'm not doing anything, and when I keep going, then I feel like that's my peace, is when I keep going and making change and making progress. Without that, if I just sat at home, that's when the struggle really starts, right? Like, why am I not doing anything? And I can have privilege to do something, and I better be doing something, right? And when I'm doing things like that, that's my peace. That's survival for me. That's, not I was looking behind my back, seeing, who's gonna come for me. It's because I'm making progress.
I agree with everything, and I don't really have much to add to that.
That's great. We have about 30 minutes for Q&A from the audience at this point. I believe that somebody's going to walk around with the microphone. Oh, Anne's going to walk around with the microphone, and please use the microphone as it's accessible for, I believe, the live streaming and all that. So, questions? Comments? Thoughts? I can wait. Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Daniel. I'm visiting Minnesota from Utah, so it's somewhat similar. We have mountains, y'all don't. Y'all have lakes. Anyways, my question is, because right now, so I graduated from social work with my bachelor's of social work. Let me repeat that twice. But I still am connected with like the university and like academic life. But what I'm seeing in Utah, and like the question that a lot of folks have over there, and it sounds like maybe y'all have the answer, is how do you create like a sustainable like community that like is based like not only on an academic level where we like have like we learn this language and like we're able to attain to it, but also like bring that back into like a community that isn't tied into that and like still have it like growing and like be intergenerational. How like do you create that and make sure that like it keeps working like as time goes on? Because I think that's the biggest struggle that we have over in Utah, especially like being like a queer person of color, is that everything's like very like fast. Like people are just trying to like move out because we live in a Mormon state that's also conservative. So
That's a great question.
I'm sorry, can you ask the question again, please? Like, I heard all of that.
Yeah.
I saw you give me the
no, I was just like, I don't remember what the question was. The question is how do you create a sustainable community, and like what does that look like?
That's a really challenging question, and you're like, oh, it seems like we have it figured out here. I think we do have a lot of amazing things happening in terms of movement and happening in this state, in Minneapolis in particular. I think it's good to recognize the different movements that are happening in different spaces, especially because like in academia, like I've been in a part of a lot of different spaces, like academia and people who don't identify with the academia community, and I feel like there's like some differences in socioeconomic status, some differences in education, and sometimes like we look at people who are in these types of institutions, and we say those folks are smarter or those folks know more, and we have this elitist way of looking at different communities, and there's different, like, I feel like a better way for these communities to work together and because there is synergy happening. Sometimes we just don't know because we're not in different types of spaces because, like, we had the 4th Precinct occupation. We had a lot of folks who actually live in that community because it was in that community, and there was some clashes going on in that space in terms of, different language that was being spoken, but there are folks there who had just as much intelligent as someone who considered to be college educated, and maybe they weren't in that space of academia and college educated, but still had a type of intelligence. And I think the sustainability comes with us valuing each other and recognizing that we may have something different than the other person, but what we have is not ultimately better than another person, or because we get trapped in ego too much. And I think that gets in the way of our work a lot. And one thing I learned about being as Standing Rock at the Red Warrior Camp is, like, we need to check our egos and figure out what we're really here for and what we're trying to do and what we're trying to move, and ground ourselves in that instead of ourselves, and instead of us thinking we're just smarter than another person, or like have more skills or whatever. Is just to be grounded in what you're really trying to do and your purpose.
How to build a sustainable community, given the academic, sometimes privilege that individuals come from, and bringing it back to community. My experience with that is MALCS, Mujeres Activas en Letras Cambio Social. That is an organization of primarily Mexican, Indigenous, Latinx, women in academia that commit to bring it back home and bring our people forward. So that's always been in my mind in organizing. How do we do that in a way that can continue to thrive? And for me, part of that has been, leaving that ego aside. Sometimes we organize, sometimes we build community in spite of the challenges. Sometimes we're working with very difficult issues, and we know we're going